Thank you for coming with us. I'm Cynthia Alcantar. I'm a postdoc at Pitzer College. I'm also a visiting faculty member. Ooh, my flag. Is that what you were trying to do? Yeah. Okay. I'm also a visiting faculty member. It's all tied up. It's okay. What is it doing? All right. It wants me to go forward, huh? So I'm also I'll just be doing this. Good practice for my finger, I guess. So I'm a visiting faculty member in sociology at Pitzer College. I graduated here actually a year ago, so it's nice to be back. And it's really nice to be here with folks who either work at, do research at, or are some kind of relationship with community colleges. Because a lot of times, so I'm a researcher who does research on community colleges. They're in my heart. My partner is a community college counselor at Long Beach City College. My family all went through the community college route, and a lot of my friends did as well. I come from Riverside. Majority of the students were first attending community colleges, and so they're really close to my heart. They're also really important institutions. They're really great institutions. So when you think about higher education institutions that really serve a greater good for our societies, community colleges are the ones, right? So oftentimes in the scholarship, we'll just leave it here and I'll explain what that is in a bit. Don't even look at that yet. We're not there yet. So a lot of times when we look at scholarship on community colleges, we often hear that many of these institutions have the non-traditional student. You'll always hear non-traditional, right? But oftentimes I'm saying these little air quotes because oftentimes these are the traditional student. Majority of undergrad students are attending are first entering through the community college route, right? Non-traditional students are often defined as first gen, low income, older students, and so, but this is the majority of our society, and so they serve a greater good of in the United States, right? So what I'm going to be presenting to you is like MSIs. You saw my title. So minority serving institutions. I'm specifically focusing on AAPIs, which are Asian serving institutions. So Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions. That's the long word for it. So AAPIs. So they fall under this umbrella of MSI. So a lot of times folks are most familiar, for example, with Hispanic serving institutions, especially in California. We have a ton of them. We have a large concentration of HSIs. But there's also historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and there's even more than this as well, but the majority fall under these four categories. But what's different between HSIs and AAPIs that are different than these two, these are slated. So from the very get-go, those were going to be HBCUs, tribal colleges. For these, they came about through a demographic shift to serve these particular populations, and so they tend to be concentrated in particular areas. So for AAPIs specifically, what I'll be focusing on, you have to have an institution that enrolls at least 10% full-time AAPI students, and 50% of these must be low income. I'm focusing on federally designated, just to be clear, because sometimes folks will say, oh yeah, that's an AAPI or that's an HSI based on enrollment numbers, but they didn't necessarily went out to seek out the federal designation. And so a lot of times, so these are often in different areas, concentrated in areas where there's a large AAPI population, so East Coast, West Coast, Pacific Islander, in the Pacific Islands and in Guam as well. And so a lot of this time, so we have institutions that are federally designated and then there's funded. Why this is important? And then there's eligible institutions. So sometimes institutions meet those minimum requirements, but they don't choose. They don't go out for that federal designation. That's another application in the through the Department of Ed to be able to qualify as a federally designated institution. And so oftentimes institutions don't want to do that for a lot of reasons. So a lot of times AAPI students in particular often have these stereotypes. Our society has these large stereotypes that, oh, they're high achieving, they're not an underrepresented minority, they're mostly at the highly selective institution, so they don't need the help. I've heard institutions also say that they choose not to go out for the designation because then they'll be seen as the Asian institution. And so there's these negative stereotypes about us helping this particular population because there's stereotypes that they're doing well, they don't need our help. And so AAPIs are really important because these institutions, especially those that finally go out and become designated and funded institutions, they're serving a particular population that there is high need in, right? So a lot of AAPI students, so oftentimes, like I said, they're seen as that they're four-year college, they're highly successful, but, and I'm glad I went after you because you presented some of the context of this, that oftentimes actually 50% of undergrad AAPI students actually first enroll at community college. These students are often also presenting a lot of the similar educational experiences as Latino populations too. Also another immigrant population, right? So a lot of them are first gen, they're low income, they're placed in developmental ed at very high rates as well. And so there is a high need in this population, but oftentimes we're not paying attention in terms of what are their needs and how can we serve them. So yeah, AAPIs are important. They serve high concentrations of low-income AAPI students. A lot of these institutions, so a lot of undergrad AAPI students are actually enrolled at these institutions. Over 50% of undergrad students are enrolled at AAPI eligible or designated institutions. And so they become really important sites to provide access, to provide services, and it also signals that they are important. They're important students. Because these institutions actually go out and seek out the designation. So I focus on AAPI. I use an added value framework. So this is often used as a cost-benefit analysis used in K-12 settings to see whether certain interventions in the K-12 setting worked. Like, are we putting the money in the right place? And so I was trying to understand, I was trying to see whether or not the federal funding for AAPI at one particular community college was it actually having an impact? Was there an added value to having that particular grant and the program that they funded through the AAPI there? So overall, these are research questions. So basically, did the AAPI program lead to better short-term and long-term outcomes? Short-term meaning, did they transition out of, transition out of developmental ed? And then long-term could be like transfer, degree attainment. We're particularly interested in targeted AAPI ethnic groups. So as we talked about earlier, so when you start disaggregating the data for AAPIs, there's very big differences between different ethnic groups in terms of their educational outcomes. This particular school, they were interested in how Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders were doing specifically. So a lot of their AAPI students were placing, so my focus was on De Anza Community College is in Cupertino, Northern California. It's located in an area that's pretty well off, but majority of their students are actually coming from the lower income areas of San Jose. And so this particular institution, they were noticing that, yeah, they would have some of the highest transfer rates, but then it wasn't, but it was disproportional with AAPI students. So the AAPI students were not transferring at the same rate as other racial groups. When they looked more deeply into the data, they saw that Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders were particularly not transferring out. Majority of them were placing in developmental ed and not coming out of that. And so they were interested in that. So I used the identified cross-sectional, longitudinal, institutional data to look at the outcomes of these students. To analyze this data, I used propensity score matching technique. So this was so that I could have a comparable sample, a comparable group that I could compare these students to. So, which means that, so instead of putting them all in two different baskets, like whether or not you participated in the learning community that was funded by the AAPI compared to all AAPIs on campus, I may be comparing apples to oranges, and so instead you try to do a comparable sample matched by age, matched by part-time versus full-time status, because if we compare a full-time student versus a part-time versus full-time, it looks really different, their educational outcomes. And so you want to do, so we did propensity score matching to try to find a similar group of students to see what the outcome it was. So they were all placed in developmental ed. We wanted to see their trajectory, and we were wanting to see, like, did they pass their developmental ed class? Once they transition out of developmental ed, did they do well? Did they persist? Did they earn a degree and so forth? And so we were looking at these two different samples. So both AAPI, one participated in learning community, one did not. Both placed in developmental ed, and then these are all the different things that they were matched on, just to try to get a comparable sample. Let me tell you a little bit about De Anza and their learning community. So their AAPI funding went directly to this particular program. So this learning community was targeting students who were placed in developmental ed that was 2 levels below the college level English. This was a year-long program where they started off on the two levels below, transitioned in. This course was paired with the AAPI literature course that was a college level credit course. They used culturally responsive practices, so a lot of the students, so the faculty, what they were using was all their literature was AAPI authors. They brought in different leaders from the community. So, for example, Congressman Mike Honda that's one of the De Anza's in his district. He would often come and speak to the students. A lot of social activists that are AAPI were also coming into the classroom as well to talk to the students. And so they were trying to get students to relate to some of the things that they were learning, right? They used comprehensive wraparound services, which means that the course was paired, they had a counselor that was paired up to that course who would come and sit in the classroom. So that's what they were doing. So a lot of my work is really collaborative. So I worked with the team at De Anza, composed of faculty, counselors, administrators, to really understand what was happening with their data, what was happening with their program. So here I am with my team. So that's De Anza. So what did we find? So overall, we're finding that students were more likely to transition from developmental ed to college level English. So again, so on this side, on the darker blue, you have the students who had the intervention of the AAPI learning community versus no learning community. Over here, you have specifically looking at Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students. So not only was it helping all AAPI students, when you look at the targeted population, it was also helping them as well. So they were transitioning out of. Then this is really important. They were transitioning and also doing it in less time. So when we look at the scholarship, when we look at the data nationally in terms of folks placing in developmental ed, many students never come out of it. And then sometimes the ones that do, it takes a really long time to get out of it. The longer you take, the less likely you are to transfer, the less likely you are to earn a degree. And so for them being able to transition and do it in less time, big deal, right? And not only were they able to transition in shorter time, but they were also likely to pass their English course. They passed their developmental ed course, and then they transitioned into the college level English, and they were passing that as well. So that's also important, and this is the same for the targeted population. And they were not just their English courses, but it was also having an impact on all their courses. So all their coursework during the term of intervention and the term following that. So it had a bigger effect than just the English courses. Students were succeeding. They were also more likely to earn an associate's degree. And so you have students, 18.8% of the students. And then I'm also presenting to you some data that wasn't statistically significant, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. So sometimes in scholarship, they only present what's statistically significant, but sometimes those numbers also mean something. And so especially for De Anza, who was particularly interested in transfer for the students, those students were transferring at a higher rate than students who did not have that intervention. And then they were also doing it in less time. And so a lot of the data that I present to you, so overall, this had a really good impact on the students' educational outcomes. It doesn't say exactly what about it did good for them, right? And so that's typical quantitative data. You're able to say like, oh yeah, it worked. But then the qualitative piece is the one that tells you what about it worked, right? Especially for the students. And so we also collected qualitative data where we interviewed students, faculty, administrators. I also sat down in classes. I spent like almost 3 years with DeAnza to see like, well, what was working? And so some of my initial findings was that something that students kept bringing up is all these different, what I'm calling culture responsive civic leadership practices that the courses were doing, or that the instructors were doing. So a lot of the students talked about the program really inspired me to go after issues that affect my community. They felt more aware. They were excited to continue learning. So it really had like a greater impact on like their motivation to continue going and to succeed. They became more engaged in their community. They were more motivated to fight for rights of Asian Americans and better their future. And so it almost added to their inspiration for why I needed to continue going. So what does this all, what implications does that have for policy and practice? So these federal programs have a big impact, are critical for institutions who serve a large concentration of underrepresented population. We need more studies like this to be able to say whether or not things are working, so that we're able to inform policy and be able to say like, yeah, you need to continue funding these types of things because it does have a bigger impact. In terms of practice, interventions, recommendations that they target a particular barrier. And so for DeAnza, for example, they wanted to specifically target transfer rates and transition rates especially for Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students. So once you have a more targeted approach, then you're able to figure out, well, what are my measures of success? Institutional research is important. So working with institutional research office, we're able to show evidence of success for the institution, and more research is needed already. Yeah, so overall, they did really well. There's certain things that there's more that we need to figure out, like exactly what about it. But yeah, as I said, some of the culturally responsive practices, especially as they were relating into their civic engagement and their connection back to the community, seemed to really help. So thank you very much for being with us today. Any questions?
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so. Yep.
Hi, Cynthia. I think that there's a very interesting connection between the work you're doing and the work that my team is doing looking at international education. And the basic issue is the cultural relative pedagogy that comes out of both. And that does in both areas. It increases access out of remedial, it increases success at all the levels, it increases transfer. And I think that might be a really interesting area to move into in the future as to the curricular aspect, as well as when you said the ability for social action, which comes out of both of the fields. So I just wanted to make sure the connections.
Yeah,
And DeAnza's a very strong study abroad.
Yeah,
in college.
And a lot of their, so it's something I didn't mention, that DeAnza, one of the important things is once you're able to see that something's working, they have actual evidence that it's successful. Sometimes institutions decide like, oh, let me get another pocket of money and do something else. They were really strategic in that they ended up trying to get extra funds to be able to replicate it with other groups. So they did a learning community very similar to it with Latino students. They did another one with Black students because they saw that there was success with this particular student group. And a lot of these MSIs, they end up serving other underrepresented minority groups as well. And so you see the benefit even for other populations once you start targeting certain interventions for these students. And a lot of the culture responsive literature, I mean, hasn't really focused on particular student groups that we don't often think of as underrepresented or that are in need of these types of targeted interventions. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Cynthia, for the rigorous evaluation. I really enjoyed it. Could you elaborate more about what DeAnza did in terms of what they used the funds from AAPI for? I think you had mentioned, if I understood you correctly, they modified the curriculum to make it more culturally relevant, and then would the Asian American students that certain students would self-select to take those courses, and that's what you evaluated. Is that the main, I guess, intervention that Deanza did? Is it more on the curriculum side?
So that's a good question. So oftentimes, so that's another thing, right? So sometimes we study these types of programs and we don't really say, well, how were they even recruited into the program? Oftentimes, students who seek out these types of programs are already really highly motivated. Like they potentially had these types of interventions before, potentially they already have the navigational capital to be able to navigate higher education systems. What Deanza did, that was, they were trying to really target everyone, and so they literally called everybody who qualified. So they were working really intensely with the IR office, institutional research, to get a list of every student that fell under the 2 levels below college level English, and phone called every single person in there to let them know about the program. So sometimes they send out emails too, and so the program in itself, everybody had access to it. They had students coming in that maybe wasn't the typical student who coming in to seeking out the program themselves, and so it was more representative, I think, than if they were to have just posted a flyer out there. So in terms of their student.
So I guess just to clarify, so is the program the community ed plus that having a track, the English track, having it culturally relevant? So you have like your standard English class that's whatever it was before, and having this culturally relevant course, and then students opting to take that, is that?
So their so initially when you're going out seeking out the funds, you have to propose what you're gonna do. So they were proposing starting a learning community altogether. So they didn't have this before. They didn't have a targeted intervention specifically for AAPI students. They just had developmental ed, and they had the Asian American studies, and that's it. With this funding, they decided to do this learning community where the students were coming in together and were taking the developmental ed course that's 2 levels below, and follow them through the first 2, the whole year. So so they were following them through. This same course was paired with the Asian American literature course. And so the students in that same week, in the same term, they were taking both courses. The instructors worked together to kind of bridge the assignments, the literature. So it wasn't your standard English course in that, oh, they were reading the classics, whatever that is, right? They were reading Asian American literature across the 2 courses. So they were learning all the grammar and all the basic, all the things, but using literature that was AAPI, and all their writing was culturally responsive as well. So it was questions about what are some of the needs in your communities, those kinds of things. So it was the whole design of it, plus the practice within it, the curriculum, even the way they were doing the classes. So the students were told you had a familia, which in Tagalog, that's family. So each student group had their familia, and you were responsible for your familia. And so the students, when they did attendance, they would say like, hey, so who's missing in your group? Susie's missing? Okay, tell me why she's missing. So you were responsible for your family, and you were responsible throughout the whole year. You were tied to these people, to this particular student group. And so they were really trying to integrate culture responsive practices at every single level. Because sometimes you see like these, sometimes programs or interventions will say like, yeah, we're culturally responsive because we're called a certain thing. Or they'll do little things, right, where they say it's culture responsive, but when you really look at it, is it culture responsive to that population, right? And so yeah, so they were being very intentional in their practices.
So thank you. I think that helps a lot, and I think that's why it's so effective.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when there's funding for these things, I think, people don't get creative, and it's just like, okay, let's offer tutoring services.
Right.
That's like the standard.
Right, and just offer it just like that. Yeah, and we did this type of study also at City College of San Francisco and at South Seattle as well, who also had an AAPI. And similar things, they were doing different things with them. City College was doing the tutoring program, but it wasn't just tutoring. They made sure to have somebody who could speak the multiple languages, because that's another thing, right? So you could offer tutoring, but then can all students access it? they were targeting STEM specifically, which was interesting, right? So then math, I mean, that's numbers, everybody can relate to that, but sometimes if you can't read it because your English, you're not there yet, like you need somebody who could be able to broker that for you, right? And so they were really intentional to bring in people who could actually tell them, in their language, what does it mean? And so that program was particularly successful as well.